What if aliens decide who lives and who dies? The question hangs in the air like the fine dust in Paul Stevens's workshop, the kind of dust that makes a shaft of late-night light look almost solid. It was 2:17 a.m. when he felt it, a change in the room that had nothing to do with the wind. The radio on his workbench, a battered AM clock, and the old floor lamp that had burned through 3 bulbs in as many months, all of it seemed to hold its breath. Paul, 69 and steady as a plane, kept a half-inch of sandpaper against the walnut board in his hands. The wood smelled like last summer and like the hands that built his house. He was used to working when the world slept. Grief has a timetable that daylight never obeys. For 2 years the nights had been longer. Linda's absence had re-architected everything. Meals, television, the way his mug sat in the sink. She had been the map of the house and his map of the days. When she died, the hours invited him to wander. He slept badly, woke at odd hours, and found himself following patterns he could not name. The same numbers on clocks, 11:11, 3:33. Birds showing up at the same window at dawn. Diane across the street calling to tell him about an owl that had perched on his fence. He told himself these were grief's tricks. Sometimes they were. Sometimes they were not. A blue-silver light pooled across the bench before the bulb ever flicked. It was not the cool of a fluorescent, nor the jaundiced warmth of the lamp. It had a depth, the way twilight does when the last color is pulling itself back. The board felt hot where his hands lay. For a moment Paul thought he'd fallen asleep upright. Then the air changed again, not in temperature, but in weight, like the room had shifted into a slightly different tuning, as if some enormous, invisible instrument had been plucked. He did not hear footsteps, he did not hear a door, but he perceived presence, and in that instant his training as a carpenter, the patient attention to grain, pressure, balance, translated into a precise steadiness of attention. He breathed and let the moment arrive. A figure, not tall and not imposing, stood in the middle of the workshop. It did not walk toward him so much as unroll into being, an economy of motion like wind moving a curtain. The contours were unfamiliar, but not monstrous. A head too smooth to be human, eyes that were not simply pupils, but pools that reflected the light like a mirror. Its skin shimmered faintly, catching and releasing the blue-silver in slow waves. The obvious things were obvious. Paul was not in any immediate danger. But the more subtle fact was stranger. He felt heard, as if the figure had known the texture of his nights for a long time. Then a voice, not spoken in air, but like an idea laid into his mind. It was calm and clear and genderless. "You keep the world together with your hands," the thought said. "We have watched."
Paul's first reaction was the old habit of explaining away what he could not place. Dreams, perhaps, at the edge of sleep. A hallucination birthed by sorrow. He clutched the sandpaper until his knuckles showed white. The figure's presence did not press, it simply was, like a lodestone. "You are awake," the voice continued, softer. "We need to tell you something you will not expect." Paul's chest tightened. Years of practicality did not prepare him for this particular vocabulary of intimacy. He wanted to call out for Diane, for anyone, but his voice stayed in his throat, small and autobiographical. Instead, he said, in the voice that had held 100 customers' complaints and 1,000 assurances, "Who are you? What do you want?" The thought came again, carrying an instruction and a map. "We are messengers, not judges. We have come to describe a fork you have not been taught about. Beginning in 2026, there will be a change in how your species experiences the world. It will unfold as a separation between overlapping realities, realities distinguished by vibrational resonance. We call it a bifurcation." He remembered later how the word landed inside him like a pebble in a jar. Bifurcation. The visitor said it plainly, as if the language had been chosen because English carried the right tone, a clinical ribbon around something surreal. "Will you decide?" Paul asked aloud. The question had the bluntness of a man trained to nail wood together to keep a roof from leaking. His fear was simple and vivid. Did this mean arbitrary selection? Did the visitor stand at some cosmic gate with a ledger of names? "Not in the way you mean," the voice answered. "We will not determine the moral worth of a being and remove them. We will describe a mechanism. Consider a tuning fork.
When one fork is struck and held near another, the second either resonates or it does not. Those that resonate with a particular tone will follow that tone's path. The signal will pass through your world. Where resonance exists, so does continuity. Where it does not, different continuity occurs. This was what he had dreaded in the phrasing of the book-lined men who came on late-night radio shows, an image of cosmic judges. Yet the visitor's language curdled that image, recasting it as measurement and revelation. They were not executioners, they were broadcasters, cartographers of frequencies. The cruelty of the title, "What if aliens decide who lives and who dies?" was suddenly both more terrifying and less simple. If the beings were describing a mechanism, their role was to make it known, not to enact final judgment. Paul tried to translate it into tools, into something his hands could touch. He thought of a radio dial, where a small knob could move you between a classical concerto and a broken station. He thought of tuning the strings on his old guitar, tightening and loosening, until the pitch was right.
The visitor's image of forks, held out across space, made more sense to him than any theological metaphor could. "We observe resonance," the visitor said. "Resonance is not solely determined by belief. It is defined by habitual emotional tone, by the recurrent quality of thought, by the patterns of action that form a human life. These create a vibrational signature. When the field of change crosses your threshold, those signatures align with different experiential pathways." Listen to how the caller framed it. Beginning in 2026, intensifying across a window of time until 2033, when a completed separation would exist. Paul might have once laughed at the specificity, but he did not laugh then. The numbers were a kind of stern clock. The visitor presented them not as a prophecy, but as an observation of timing, a window for preparation and attention. "You are asking me to change," Paul said. "All of us?" "Every consciousness is tuned," the voice replied. "Some changes will be abrupt to observers, others will be gradual. There will be signs your kind can learn to recognize." In the workshop, the light bent differently. The visitor gestured with a hand that looked almost like a carpenter's, knuckles, joints, fingers that could have been made to hold a plane. The gesture unspooled a vision that Paul did not have to consent to see. The room folded into a corridor of images, as if someone had turned a projector toward him and the grain of his life was the film. He saw Earth, not as a globe in the sky, but as two films superimposed. One film was a faded newsreel, gray skies, faces drawn, cities with glass and iron but little else. The other was luminous, shot in colors so full they felt like music, people moving with collaborative lightness, strangers sharing bread, neighborhoods breathing like living organs. The contrast was more than visual. It felt as if each film emitted a different key. The lower film buzzed at a frequency that made teeth ache. The higher film hummed like a choir warmed by sunlight. "You will see it as divergence," the visitor transmitted. "Not all will leave the same way. Some will find their path to the higher resonance through steady practice. Some will remain in familiar fields and find other roads of learning there. This is not punishment, it is differentiation." Paul kept remembering Linda's hands more than her face, the way she smoothed the collar of his shirt, the small hemisphere of a callus at the base of her thumb. Grief had taught him how the smallest gestures could reshuffle the center of a life. The visitor's words landed against that memory like an echo. He wanted to ask whether Linda would be where, but he was careful. The presence in the workshop had that kind of grace. It allowed questions without immediate answers, as if the clearest thing it could do was to create better questions. "What can a man like me do?" he heard himself say. The question had the muteness of a man who had learned to fix what could be fixed with clamps and glue. "Change your habit of tone," the visitor answered. "We can show you practices, concrete actions that consistently alter a signature over time. None are magic, none guarantee a specific outcome. They increase alignment with the higher frequency, and thus the probability of experiencing that continuity." The alien listed 7 practices then, not as commandments, but as pragmatic, repeatable acts. Paul later remembered them like steps on a ladder, each rung a different texture. "Gratitude," the voice said. "Conscious daily work. Time in nature. Forgiveness of the self and others. Small, steady acts of service. Dialogue with those who have passed, when appropriate and with care. Intentionally chosen community." For each name the visitor spoke, a short vision lit. A set of small, human scenes that felt like photographs. Paul sitting at a tiny kitchen table with a cup of coffee, listing things he was grateful for. His hands at the lathe, focused and unhurried. His feet on cold ground at sunrise in a field where the cardinals would come. The way he was able to let go of an old anger at a brother and place it in a drawer. Him carrying a bag of groceries to a neighbor's doorway. Him reading aloud a letter to Linda that felt like a conversation. And finally, him joining a small, ragged group in Diane's living room, where people simply listened to each other. These were not exotic rites. They were the opposite, humble, repetitive, ordinary. The visitor's emphasis was always on repetition and the accrual of small changes. You do not need to master them, the voice said. You need to start them imperfectly. Paul had never thought of his life as a frequency before. He had thought of it as a series of days. Yet there was a plausibility to the idea that days add up to a tonal shape. A decade of bitterness would be a different instrument than a week of gratitude. He felt the weight of his own decades. Work, dinner, the go-boards he had declined to buy because Linda liked the look of plainness in their living room. He wondered, not without shame, how much of him had been tuned to fear through simple habit, the cautiousness that closed him off, the grudge he nursed about payments someone had missed, the way grief sometimes folded into a shriveling suspicion. The visitor did not moralize. It only offered a map. That map had edges. It spoke of external signs to watch for during the crossover years. You will see divergence in memory, it said. Families will report different accounts of the same days. Technology will fail in odd patterns. Some systems will cease to behave as expected. There will be sudden disappearances, which will be experienced in different ways by different observers. The voice was careful. These are descriptions of phenomena. They are not judgments. Paul listened, trying to hold the images without flinching.
The idea of someone vanishing, gone without physical evidence, was a chill in his marrow. He thought of Susan, his daughter, who lived in another town and called twice a week. He thought of Sarah, his 4-year-old granddaughter, who drew suns with 7 rays and stuck the pictures on the refrigerator with the magnet shaped like a cow. Will Linda... His throat closed. He stopped the sentence, ashamed of its simplicity and terrified of the answer. She will not be taken from you by us, the visitor said, and there was a softness in that phrasing that made the phrase sound almost like a promise. Attachment will be transformed by change. In the vision, you will learn of bonds that persist beyond form as patterns of resonance. We cannot alter your private history. We can point to continuities that endure. That answer was equally strange. Not a clear location, not a neat reunion, but an assurance that bond is pattern, and where pattern persists, experience does too. Paul remembered a night months earlier when he had woken with a certainty that Linda had touched his shoulder. He had laughed at himself, then sat up and called her name into the dark. He did not laugh at that memory now. The visitor's phrasing made some of the private oddities of grief seem like signals rather than madness. After the initial explanations, the visitor did not leave him in the workshop. Instead, it invited him, gently, without coercion, to see more. He felt himself rise from the bench as if his body were a machine obeying an instruction that the mind had already given. He was not afraid, which surprised him. The fear that had hot-wired his nights now felt like a separate current, not in charge of his movements. Inside the vessel, if that is what the space was, time behaved differently. Paul sat in a chair that conformed to his spine and watched a sequence of images that felt like a teacher using models. The visitor used metaphors that touched his life. Think of your neighborhood as a radio station, it said. When more people tune to the higher channel, the broadcast strengthens. You cannot force a neighbor's dial, but you can adjust your own. The image was deliciously simple to someone who had spent a lifetime tightening screws or aligning hinges. The two Earths came into sharper relief in the vision. The lower frequency Earth was populated by scenes of scarcity. Breadlines, people staring at screens that reflect back only their anxieties, cities where buildings read like fortress walls, interpersonal interactions transactional and thin. There were images of children learning fear as curriculum and of gatherings dominated by competition and suspicion. The higher frequency Earth, by contrast, glowed with practicality and warmth. People traded tools and knowledge instead of fortunes. Markets were places where creativity was exchanged rather than hoarded.
The architecture, Paul noticed this, and the detail lodged in him, bled into the streets, which were more gardens than paved thoroughfares. Mercy was ordinary. There were more musicians than bankers, in the sense that expression and craft took precedence over accumulation. When disputes happened, they moved through circles of listening rather than adversarial cages. The visitor emphasized that neither side equated to moral binary. There is learning in both, it said. The lower field is not evil, it is dense. The higher field is more transparent and reciprocal. Those who remain in denser patterns will have their own curricula. Compassion is necessary in both directions. Paul felt relief that the visitor framed things with such ethical nuance. He had seen enough late-night shows to know the human tendency to polarize. The idea that a neighbor who struggled with anger or addiction was in some cosmic shorthand morally condemned by a superior order made his jaw set. The visitor's words let him breathe. They also complicitly required him to act differently. Compassion would not be a sentiment, it would be a practical skill. When the visitor described the 7 practices in more detail, it did not dress them in mysticism. Gratitude was a notebook kept by a bedside. Conscious work meant approaching any task with attention. If you swept a floor, sweep as if you were building an altar. Time in nature was literal, skin on bark, the cold of mornings, listening to the wind through leaves. Forgiveness was practiced not as absolution, but as the quiet act of lifting a weight a little each day. Small service was ordinary gestures, buying a neighbor a loaf of bread, staying with someone for an hour who needed company. Dialogue with the departed was framed carefully. When it was done with humility and grounding, and without the promise of funerary theatrics, it could be a method of reintegrating grief into living. Conscious community meant curating circles of people where honesty and mutual accountability were practiced. You will not master a higher tone in a single day, the visitor admitted. You will not be saved by a single act. The change is cumulative. Each practice shifts the pattern by a fraction. Over months and years, those fractions add. You have an opportunity to tilt these fractions in your favor. Paul imagined them, the fractions, the seconds he spent softening a brow with a phone call, the minutes of walking in the park, the hours he might devote to listening rather than correcting. It was a plausible calculus, and the practical tone of the visitor made the whole thing less like a prophecy and more like a regimen. There were also warnings. The visitor described odd external phenomena that would accompany the gradual separation, failing networks in one place and working ones in another, families disagreeing about what happened on a given day, devices that simply stopped linking to one another in patterns that made no technical sense.
The visitor insisted these were observations of the field changing, not tools of fear. Do not let the fear of these signs become the drumbeat of your life, it cautioned. Use them as indicators the way you would use weather. Prepare, not panic. Paul thought of storm windows, of closing the house against rain. He took the metaphor inside himself and found it easier to put a plan in place. During the encounter, the visitor also offered small proofs by its standard. It did not perform miracles in the theatrical sense. Instead, it mirrored things from Paul's life with a precision that felt like testimony. It told him what time Linda had once placed a pressed violet in a book he'd kept from their honeymoon. It named a phrase Linda had used to sign off her letters. It recited the sound he had heard the night months earlier when he believed she had touched his shoulder. That precision was not to coerce belief, but to create trust. The visitor used artifact and memory as glue for the conversation. When the meeting ended, Paul found himself back in the slightly mismatched domestic geometry of his workshop. The clock read 3:12 a.m. The blue-silver light had retreated to the corner where oil cans gathered dust. The smell of walnut was unchanged. Grief had not been erased. But something else had shifted, as if the grain of the wood had opened to reveal a new ring. He did not leap into action. He sat down on a low stool and let his hands rest on his thighs. For a long time he looked at the sanded plank, at the gouge where a nail had once been, at the radio that had never carried anything he wanted to hear until then. He thought of Diane's soft invitations to attend a neighborhood circle. He thought, with an odd mixture of private shame and clarity, of the days he had shortened his prayers to complaints. The first practical thing he did was trivial. He reached into his pocket and found the folded receipt he had kept with Linda's signature. He traced the loop of her handwriting with a fingertip and spoke aloud, not really sure if he was asking or telling. "Okay," he said. "I'll try." If you want to hear more eyewitness accounts like this and practical steps you can test in your own life, subscribe. Paul's story is one of many collected testimonies, and the more careful listening we do, the better we can learn to act without panic. He slept until early light, and when dawn came it felt more like a promise than a threat.
The first day after the encounter, he did not become a different man. He boiled the same coffee, forgot the sugar, and ate a slice of toast with the vague distraction of someone who had not yet rearranged his life. But then he did something he had not done in months. He went outside and walked until the neighbor's field opened like a book. In that field, the cardinals, always the cardinals, arrived almost at once. They seemed to move with an intention Paul could not explain, alighting on a fence as if marking a margin.
He had always liked those birds for reasons he could not articulate. Now they felt like punctuation marks in a sentence he was finally willing to read. The first practice he tried that morning was gratitude. He sat on a rock, the wind on his face, and said aloud 3 things he was grateful for. He did not pretend to be ecstatic. His voice cracked. But he noted a slight unclenching in the chest, a softening as if the body recognized the permission to let some tightness move out. Over the next weeks, he attempted the other practices in small ways. Conscious work meant taking an extra 5 minutes to really look at the cabinet he was restoring instead of checking his phone. Time in nature was 5 minutes in the yard at dawn, shoes off in the dew. Forgiveness took the form of a letter he wrote to an old friend he had not spoken to in years. He did not expect a reply. Small service manifested as a loaf of bread left on Diane's doorstep with a note that read, simply, "Thinking of you." The conversation with the departed came awkwardly. He read aloud a letter to Linda at the window where she had once planted pansies, and he allowed the act to be more about listening than performing. Conscious community began in a modest way with Diane, who introduced him to a weekly group that met to talk about what they learned and what they practiced. He practiced imperfectly. He missed mornings. He forgot lists. He carried old resentments into new days. The visitor had been clear. None of these practices created instant elevation. The change was incremental. Still, Paul noticed tiny shifts, a phone call that resolved without argument, a warming in Susan's voice when she rang, a moment with Sarah when the child put her small, paint-stained hand in his and declared the son beautiful without irony. And always the motif of numbers followed him, a clock showing 11:11 the morning he decided to start a gratitude notebook, 3:33 the night he mailed the forgiveness letter. He began to notice how these small repeated things, birds, numbers, the way a certain patch of light moved across the floor, tied the days together, gave them seam and texture. They did not prove the visitor's claims. They simply sat like evidence that something in the field of experience had shifted. He was not naive. Neighbors had their own alarms and politics and small crises. He had to balance the invitations of the vision with bread and butter responsibilities. Susan texted him to remind him of a doctor's appointment. He kept it. Diane needed help with a leaky roof. He fixed it. The visitor had been explicit that one should not forsake practical duties in favor of spiritual experiments. He honored that caution because it made moral sense and because it was sane in the small human ways he knew how to be sane. One evening, some weeks into the ritual of small acts, he received a call that introduced a new kind of whisper into his life.
It was a neighbor across town who said, in a voice pitched too high with worry, that a girl down the block had vanished for 3 hours and returned with no memory of where she had been. The neighbor's story was raw and rattling, and not the kind of thing you could easily file. Paul listened, and for the first time since the workshop, felt the distant echo of the visitor's description of external signs. The observation did not turn his practice into fear. It made him more attentive. That attention was a different kind of readiness, less like stockpiling and more like habit formation. He found himself noticing where his tolerance tightened and softened. He noticed compassion like a muscle that needed exercise. He stretched it. The vigilance the visitor had called for was not a vigilant watch for doom, but a preparedness to respond, to be useful in small ways. At night, sometimes, he felt Linda's presence as a pressure at the small of his back when he rose from bed. Sometimes he dreamed of a ship hovering like a whale over a field. Sometimes the dream was only a whisper of light. He learned to hold these things without demanding they become proof. The visitor had taught him that resonance messages are not coercive, they invite. He had no guarantee that the pathway he was following would result in the brighter film overlaying his days. He understood the grammar of probability, not the certainty of salvation. One clear morning, as he closed the shed door behind him and walked towards his truck, a small girl on the next sidewalk turned and waved. It was Sarah, running ahead of her mother. She skipped towards him with the kind of unedited, loud affection only small children possess. She dropped a drawing into his hands, a sun with 7 rays and a crooked house. Her bright complaint at the world's unfairness, when the ice cream fell from a cone, when a toy broke, sounded like a life lesson he had been forgetting.
In his pocket, the folded receipt with Linda's handwriting warmed against his thigh. He felt, in a way that was not mystical, but stubbornly corporeal, that something inside him was tuning. He had begun to change his daily frequency, in the modest human ways the visitor had suggested. The shock of the arrival had receded. What remained was the labor of practice. The account he later told others began here, in the sanding dust, in the blue-silver light, in the small acts of repair and gratitude. He told it again not to create fear, but to hand a map that had seemed to him both urgent and merciful. The title of the question people asked, "What if aliens decide who lives and who dies?" had an edge to it that he did not relish. Yet the truth he carried was different, and to his mind, kinder. Aliens had not come to pronounce doom, but to describe a mechanism, to hand people a series of small, repeatable practices that could realign their lives toward a different experience of reality.
When the phone rang late that afternoon, Susan's voice on the other end asked if he was all right. She had been reading some online forums and was worried people were panicking. He answered with a steadiness he was still learning to own. "I'm fine," he said. "I'm trying something. I'm not saying it's a miracle. I'm trying to be a little kinder to the days." There was a pause. "If this is about Linda," she started, and he could hear the softness on the line that made her a daughter rather than an advisor. "I miss her too." "Me too," he said, and let the sound of the word hold both grief and the possibility of change. Paul's days thereafter were ordinary and deliberate. He misstepped, he recovered. He felt joy that was sometimes only the small kind, the kind that tastes like coffee warmed because you remembered to scoop sugar. He began to see the world less like a battleground he had to defend, and more like an instrument he could tune. But even as he practiced, the image of the bifurcation remained. The visitor had given him a window of time, and with it the ache of urgency. Knowing a window exists alters the ways you spend minutes. The visitor's years, 2026 through 2033, were not far off from where he stood. If the vision was right, then the choices he and others made in small, ordinary ways mattered. If the vision was wrong, he had still gained a life slightly softened by gratitude and presence. The question that had opened the entire encounter, the blunt title that made it possible for strangers to ask and for him to answer, remained on his mind. What does it mean to say aliens decide who lives and who dies? He had learned enough to reshape the phrase. They did not stand at a tribunal. They described a sorting mechanism that, once described, offered agency rather than removed it. That reframing did not end the night. It only pushed the problem into the long haul. How do you get a community, neighbors, friends, family, to tune themselves differently? How do you extend compassion to people who distrust your language, who call it madness, or who are afraid of being judged? The visitor had been clear that the work required no perfection, but it still required courage. It required people willing to begin. A week later, as twilight spread low and the workshop lamp threw an orange pool across the bench, Paul set aside the sanded plank. He picked up a fresh sheet of paper and wrote a list. It was not a prophetic list nor a sermon. It was simple. 3 practices to do tomorrow. He folded the paper and tucked it into his shirt pocket where the receipt with Linda's handwriting had lived. Outside, the cardinals called, small punctuation marks. Inside, the radio hummed on a station that played an old song Linda liked. The room felt smaller and somehow larger at once. The way a house is both shelter and the place you learn how to live. Ahead lay more images the visitor had shown him, the sharper contrasts between the two earths, the practical steps communities could take, the external signs that might make people panic or prepare. There would be conversations with neighbors who laughed and with others who cried. There would be the hard work of practice that seemed, at times, too small for the scale of the question. There would also be moments of grace that seemed perversely, perfectly proportioned. He closed the workshop door quietly and walked to the back porch, where a sky half silver, half pink waited. He did not know whether the bifurcation would happen exactly as described. He only knew that something had happened inside him that made the title's horror into a summons, an invitation to live differently in the time he had left to choose. The blue-silver light in the corner was gone. The grain of the wood in his hands felt like a place to measure a life. He put his palm flat across the plank, as if to feel the ring of years, and with a steady breath, decided to keep tuning. Days folded into weeks, and then into a strange kind of rhythm. The blue-silver light had become for Paul less a single miraculous event, and more a hinge on which the rest of his life swung. He kept the folded paper with the list of 3 things tucked beside Linda's receipt. It lived in his shirt pocket like a quiet vow. He did not set out to become an emissary or a prophet. He simply continued to show up, at the bench, at Diane's circle,
at Susan's calls, and, most painfully, at the slow work of listening to himself when old habits nudged toward fear. As spring edged toward summer, the world outside his workshop began to reflect the visitor's words in ways that were small but undeniable. None of the things he noticed were dramatic enough by themselves to confirm an otherworldly prediction, yet taken together they made a pattern that kept coming back to the same question. What did it mean to live as if a bifurcation were possible? One morning, Susan came down for coffee with a look Paul had not seen since Linda's funeral, more tight than grief, edged with a new tension. She had read forums, yes, but what worried her was what she read on the local news, a cluster of accounts from neighboring towns where people reported brief, disorienting lapses, neighbors who could not remember which week it was, friends who described dinner conversations with different outcomes, traffic lights that stayed on the same color for minutes at a time. Engineers interviewed on television shrugged. Their terms were technical and careful. The anchors used words like anomalous and unexplained. Susan kept asking questions Paul could not answer. "I don't want you wandering into something dangerous," she said, more gently than Paul expected. "You believe what you believe. I just worry." Paul did not try to argue facts.
He told her plainly what he had been told, that the visitor described a change in resonance, that it might present as shifts people could perceive differently, and that the suggested practices were intended as ways to alter the tone of one's life. He did not offer certainty. He offered his own experience, nights where he felt Linda's presence, mornings when the cardinals arrived as if on a cue, a growing softness when he remembered to list 3 things he was grateful for. Susan listened with a mixture of relief and skepticism, and when she left, she hugged him as if both were necessary at once. In town, reactions were fractious. Some people mocked, others panicked. Diane's circle grew from 6 to a dozen to nearly 30, and with those numbers came a dilution of intimacy and the need for new boundaries. People arrived with grief, with politics, with small grievances about power and money, and they asked for clear answers that no one had. Paul learned quickly that earnestness could look like delusion to someone else, and that being willing to act kindly did not inoculate a person against ridicule. At the monthly gathering Paul and Diane hosted in her living room, voices rose and softened in an effort to find bearing. An older woman named Rhea told of a neighbor who, for an entire afternoon, remembered a funeral that had not happened. A young man named Omar spoke about his sister's phone showing photographs he had never taken. A retired teacher named Helen confessed to crying when she realized she had forgiven an old debt in her heart, and it felt like a small liberation. The stories were loose threads without a master pattern. Paul mostly listened and occasionally read a short passage from his notebook, 3 things he had noticed, 3 steps he was trying to hold to that week. The visitor's timetable came with a particular cruelty, specificity without guarantee. 2026 was a door that had been opened, the visitor had said. 2026 through 2033 was the window where the field would recompose. The years themselves felt both close and oddly abstract. The calendar dates lived more as pressure than as prophecy, like the knowledge of an approaching tide that would not be the same on every coast. Paul's work in the shop continued, the wood obedient to hand and tool, but the presence of that timetable made him more deliberate about how he spent minutes and whom he listened to. One afternoon in late spring, the neighborhood experienced its first clear, confounding sign. Old Mr. Jennings, who lived 3 houses down, vanished from his porch for half an hour. His wife, who had been watching from their kitchen window, stepped outside to find his chair still warm but the man gone. She called the police, who found no tracks and no sign of forced entry. Mr. Jennings returned as the sun was dipping, bewildered and unable to account for the time. He described, in a voice that trembled with genuine confusion, a span of hours that felt dreamlike and impossible to place. Some neighbors interpreted the event as evidence of the stranger's claims. Others called it a hoax, until they met Mr. Jennings' eyes and heard the tremor beneath his words. Paul met the couple the next day when he delivered a loaf of bread. Their relief at seeing a neighbor with a shovel and a willingness to listen was immediate and simple. The experience did not make Paul cocky, it made him careful. He had the visitor's words to frame the incident. These were the sorts of phenomena the visitor had described: memory divergence, intermittent disappearances. The visitor had been clear that such things were not proof of moral failure and that they could be frightening to people unprepared for ambiguity. Use them as signals, the visitor had said, not as final verdicts. In this period of small shocks, Paul's practices tightened. He said aloud his gratitude more often, sometimes in Diane's yard with a thermos between his knees. He approached each task, sanding, fitting, repairing, as an act that deserved full attention. Where before his hands had moved with efficient mimicry, they now worked with a quieter mindfulness, as if the timber were a teacher and
and the grain a lesson. Forgiveness, the visitor had said, was a work of small increments. Paul tried it by writing a letter to his estranged brother, Roger. He did not mail the letter right away. He folded it and placed it under a stack of bills, then slid it into the back of a drawer, where it lived like a seed. Weeks later he found it again, and saw that merely writing the words had loosened something inside him. He still did not expect the brother to respond. Still, the act changed the pattern of his heartbeat when Roger's name came up. The conversations with the departed became for Paul a practice of humble listening rather than theatrical mediumship. He would sit by the window where Linda had planted pansies and speak softly to her, not in expectation of proof, but as a way of making room for grief to breathe. He read some of her letters aloud, and sometimes he imagined that the cadence of her voice returned in his bones. He told himself these were private resources, personal anchors, and that anyone else's mileage would vary. The visitor's teaching about community was the hardest part. Intentional groups, the visitor had said, could strengthen the broadcast of a higher tone, but human groups are complicated and imperfect. Diane's circle practiced careful listening, an instruction that asked members to speak for themselves and to avoid offering unsolicited solutions. Sometimes that discipline worked. Other times, old hurts found a way to escalate. Paul learned to sit with the messiness and to stay away from trite salvage operations. He did not give pious speeches. He brought bread. He held space for people to describe what they feared. Not everyone wanted to listen.
Some neighbors called the meetings cultish. Others accused them of exploiting grief. Rumors spread that the group sought to recruit followers into secrecy. Paul found himself trying to be a conduit rather than an evangelist. He helped a man named Matteo, who had been reluctant to admit a drinking problem, get in touch with the local clinic. He drove Rhea to a doctor's appointment when her arthritis flared. These were small acts, mundane and stubborn. They were the sorts of service the visitor had suggested, ordinary, steady, close to the bone. Outside of their little civic experiments, the larger world kept sending mixed signals. In a nearby city there were reports, circulated on social media and picked up by national outlets, of planes that changed flight paths in inexplicable ways, of GPS systems that sent drivers in loops, and of instruments used by scientists showing anomalous readings that the scientists themselves could not initially explain. Papers published cautious statements, politicians called for calm, religious leaders offered interpretations that often reflected their own traditions. The visitor's words were, in those forms, just another voice in an overcrowded chorus. Paul watched as people fractured into brittle camps, the skeptics, the believers, the opportunists. He worried about the moral fractures that might occur if communities chose to weaponize fear. The visitor had made compassion central. Those who remain in denser patterns are not immoral, it had said. They are differently tuned, with curricula of their own. Your responses will define the tone of your field. Paul tried to remember that when he met anger with anger and when he felt the temptation to judge. As summer warmed into a dry July, a more personal test came when Susan herself encountered something she could not explain. She called Paul in the middle of the afternoon, her voice tight with the kind of alarm that made him set the bench tools down and walk to the back porch. She said her bank account had 2 deposits she did not make and a debit she didn't recall authorizing. Her phone, trusted and modern, displayed messages she had not written. She described with a careful professional calm born of years as a nurse manager, a sense that the sequence of events in one evening did not match the minutes recorded on the wall calendar. Paul listened, and then he told her what the visitor had said about technology fragmenting in unpredictable ways during periods of divergence. He warned her not to abandon her responsibilities. Call the bank, secure accounts, document the discrepancies. Practical steps, not panicked leaping into myth. He reminded her of the value of careful recording. Write down anomalies, take photographs, keep receipts. That practical posture seemed to satisfy Susan for a time. She completed a report, called the bank, and later texted a photograph of the corrected ledger. Such incidents made Paul's practice both urgent and ordinary. He learned to be a neighbor who combined spiritual tenderness with practical action, someone who would bring soup and also help fill out a claim form. It was, in a way, the posture the visitor had seemed to suggest: prepare, not panic. By the time the calendar flipped toward autumn, the neighborhood had its share of strange tales. An elementary classroom misremembered a holiday assignment. A group of cousins contested who had attended a wedding. A grocery chain's inventory system failed in one county and not in the next. These were the kinds of stories that made for late-night drinking table talk, eerie, fragmentary, headline-ready. But beneath the spectacle, there was a simpler reality for Paul. Hands stained with varnish, a card with Linda's handwriting, a small community meeting where someone admitted they had cried that week and not known why. Those things, he came to believe, mattered more.
In October, his little group decided to try a public service-oriented experiment. They organized a day to clear debris from a neglected park and to bring fresh soil for the community garden. They invited neighbors regardless of belief. The turnout was better than expected. Skeptical faces came, obliged by hunger for something to do, or curiosity, or the desire to prove themselves right. Paul and Diane led a circle at the start where no one spoke as an expert. People offered practical help: water for those who had labored too long, a shared thermos of coffee, a cart to move compost. At one point, as the sun dropped and the cardinal motif returned, Susan joined with Sarah at her side. The child dashed through the dirt as if it were a page to be colored in, her laughter catching on the wind. Paul watched her and felt something like an affirmation. Small, domestic, almost unbearably tender. He was not immune to the more sensational stories, but he had begun to find refuge in work that made the present kinder and more bearable. Not everyone reacted well to such gestures. A neighbor named Todd accused the group of grandstanding in the park, calling what they did cheap sentiment and demanding the council remove their tools. The confrontation was ugly, public. For a moment, Paul felt the old reflex of anger. He remembered the visitor's instruction about compassion as practical skill and tried to hold that posture when Todd shouted that people were being manipulated by fear. In the end, a council member intervened with a conciliatory tone, and the group's work continued, scarred and imperfect, but real. As the months accumulated, Paul's practices deepened in modest ways. He added a morning of silence, not to transcend the world, but to listen to it. Birds, wind, the distant hum of traffic. He took up a small journal of gratitude and filled it with crooked handwriting. He made a point of offering forgiveness where he could, even if it felt insufficient.
He kept showing up at Diane's circle and found himself more comfortable holding space for younger people who were frightened. And then came the night that changed the tenor of the neighborhood's conversations. It started like many others. A neighbor's porch light flicked oddly. A dog barked. Someone swore they saw a streak of light beyond the tree line. But what followed ramped up the fear in a way that made many people take shelter in their phones, refreshing feeds for answers that never came. In a nearby county, multiple eyewitnesses reported seeing a low, slow craft moving over a river. Police reports were filed. A handful of reliable witnesses, train operators, a school bus driver, described the thing as larger than a car but smaller than a ship, and moving in a way that did not align with aircraft protocols. The national media picked the story up, and that night talk radio filled with hot takes, every host trying to prove or disprove whatever he wanted to be true. Paul turned off the television. He had seen the visitor once. He did not crave spectacle. But he could not help feeling the old coldness of being very small inside a very large pattern. Susan texted him a simple line, "Are you watching?" He replied that he was, but that he was trying to stay steady. He reminded her, the way the visitor had counseled, that the presence of such objects, if that's what they were, did not equal malevolence. In the days that followed, the news cycle swung from alarm to introspective debate to simple boredom. The craft sightings were verified in some accounts, dismissed in others. In the eye of that hurricane lived Paul's little inner life, his practice of gratitude, his repairs, his bread on Diane's steps. The world outside became a tangle of pods, some ready to panic, some ready to profit, some ready to interpret any anomaly as validation for their own ideologies. Paul tried, as always, to be useful rather than to be right. It was in that tender and turbulent season that he received another invitation, this time more subtle than the original blue-silver light. He was sanding a table in his workshop when the room cooled in the way he now recognized. A shift of weight, a softening of air, and a tension that felt like someone watching over his shoulder. The presence did not unroll itself this time. Instead, the visitor's transmission came as an image pressed gently into his mind. Not a directive, but an encouragement to tell the story he had, and to do so with honesty and compassion. "You have been given a map," the visitor's thought said. "Maps are only useful when used. Teach as you can. Build as you can. Live with those your hands touch." Paul was not led to shout from rooftops. He was led to act in the small, consistent ways he had learned were effective. More dinners with Susan when possible, more time with Sarah, more listening in Diane's circle, more practical help with neighbors. He was led, the visitor seemed to imply, to be a node of steadiness rather than a prophet of doom. At the same time, the visitor's broader message about frequency and resonance began to accumulate detail that Paul found both comforting and terrifying. It said again and again that resonance is not a moral score, but a reflection of habitual tone, patterns of thought, recurring emotional colorings, and the cadence of action. A decade of sorrow and bitterness makes a different signature than months of cultivation and gratitude. That did not mean the one who had lived in sorrow was condemned. It simply meant different experiences might result when the field of the world recomposed. Those words guided Paul in a particularly hard conversation with a friend named Carl, a man prone to conspiracy and who had begun to speak with a venom Paul recognized from his own old guarded days. Carl's language was hot with certainty, and when he accused Paul's practice of being a grift or a way for people to avoid dealing with real problems, Paul felt his patience thin. He told Carl quietly about the visitor's emphasis on compassion and the necessity of practical help, how the group had driven neighbors to doctors and had mended a roof for a woman with arthritis. Paul did not convert Carl. He did not expect to. He wanted only to model that being tuned to a higher frequency did not mean abandoning critical thought, nor did it mean losing one's rights to skepticism. If anything, Paul's life became an exercise in balancing conviction and humility, to act without clinging to outcomes, to speak with firmness without authoritarianism, to practice and not pressure. The visitor had cautioned against coercion. You do not force a neighbor's dial, it had said. Adjust your own. That image of tuning, not trumping, stayed with him. By the time winter edged forward again, there were enough reports in distant counties of persistent memory divergence and intermittent technology failures that official bodies convened panels to discuss phenomena. The language used in formal settings was careful, bureaucratic, and lacking in the warmth of human witness. For many people, the official reports satisfied nothing. Some communities formed mutual aid networks to help each other with paperwork, with rides to appointments, and with listening sessions. Paul helped organize one such network in their town, a coordination of practical resources and neighborly goodwill that, in his small view, mattered more than any debate in a cable studio. On a cold afternoon, a young mother named Jen brought her son to Diane's circle. He was 10, prone to nightmares, and she worried that the child's sleep terrors were tied to online videos he had watched. Jen asked for no grand answers, only for help teaching the boy how to breathe. The group sat with him and practiced grounding exercises, simple breaths, hands on knees, naming 5 things you can see. The boy went home quieter than when he had arrived.
For Paul, this was a victory not because it proved anything about the visitor, but because it meant they were learning tools to help one another weather uncertainty. And then, near the end of the year, Paul received an unmistakable synchronicity that felt like a small reassurance rather than a grand sign. He was at the bench, oil rag in hand, when his radio, a battered thing he had not trusted since his youth, tuned to a station that played a song Linda had loved. It was the sort of coincidence that might be written off as random, but it made him smile the way remembering a beloved joke does. He thought he felt, in that small music, the persistence of continuity across patterns. He did not claim it as proof, he claimed it as comfort. The passage toward the year 2026 had not been a straight line. There were nights when the visitor's picture of 2 layered Earths felt terrifying in its implications. There were mornings when the practice of gratitude reduced the fear to a manageable hum. Paul learned to live with uncertainty by training attention toward usefulness. As the date arrived, the neighborhood did not morph overnight. There was no dramatic trumpet or film strip snap. Instead, life continued, sometimes with anomalies and sometimes smooth. The visitor's window had begun, as it had indicated, but it did not reduce the world to a single narrative. People argued more in traffic, someone wrote a novel, a child's habit became a family tradition. The bifurcation the visitor had described remained for Paul both a real possibility and an ethic. How to spend one's minutes now, with gentleness. The final months of the period the visitor had defined, leading forward toward 2033, would, the traveler had said, be a long arc of differentiation, not an instant parting. Paul thought often of that long arc on evenings with Sarah asleep in his lap, her breath steady and small. He would stroke the line of her palm and feel the persistence of life in ways he had not allowed himself to feel since Linda's death. He taught her to notice cardinals, to count clouds, to name 3 things she liked about the day. These small exercises, the visitor had said, shift the music of a life. In public conversations, Paul felt pressed to answer the title question that first hooked strangers to his story. What if aliens decide who lives and who dies? He usually answered with the same patient correction.
The visitor did not decide in a judicial sense, he would explain. The visitor described a mechanism. It told of resonance and pathways of experience. If that sounded like a decision, he admitted, then the title was doing its job of provoking attention. But it was essential to reshape the horror into something actionable. Knowledge of a mechanism opens the possibility of agency. People responded in different ways. Some found relief in that reframe.
They felt empowered to adopt practices that increased their own probability of aligning with what the visitor called the higher resonance. Others accused him of offering a moral calculus disguised as spiritual guidance. Paul could not stop the ethical objections. He could only continue to stress the visitor's insistence on compassion, that those in denser patterns were not morally condemned, and that helping one another mattered more than labeling. At the center of his argument was an ethic of smallness. Be kinder. Do your work with full attention. Forgive when you can. Spend time in nature. Offer consistent service. Speak with the dead when it helps to integrate grief, but approach that dialogue with humility. Find a circle of people who hold you accountable and who reflect your better self. These things were not glamorous, nor were they a shower that would guarantee transcendence. They were, however, actions that reoriented a life from contraction toward a more open tone. As the years unfurled toward 2033, differences became more pronounced in some places and barely perceptible in others. People separated into various patterns of living, not as moral verdicts, but as different curricula. Paul watched, sometimes with sorrow, as some friends hardened. He watched, sometimes with sorrow, as others found a stubborn, radiant softness. He held to the visitor's instruction, practice with compassion rather than pronounce. In his quieter moments, he returned to the beach of his own grief, the place where Linda's absence still had tidal power. The conversations with her, those private letters read aloud at the window, did not become proof of anything. They simply remained a thread. He found that his grief could be a companion rather than an imprisonment when he allowed it to be honest and small and present. Eventually, Paul was asked by a younger journalist to put his experience into a short piece that would appear on a local site. The journalist wanted drama and quotes. Paul wanted to say something that might be useful. He wrote lines that were plain and deliberate. We are all tuning our lives by what we think, feel, and do each day. Small, kind acts accumulate. We do not know the limits of what will happen, but we can choose the tone of our lives. He submitted the piece with a small photograph of his hands on a plank of walnut. It ran without fanfare, and a few people from across town reached out to tell him they had tried the 3 small practices he suggested: gratitude lists, focused work, and a cup of quiet in the morning. They said their days felt a little different. That, to Paul, felt like an answer. By the time 2033 approached on the horizon, the community had learned a new vocabulary for ambiguity. They had learned to be useful to one another. They had learned in fits and starts that compassion could be practiced like a muscle.
Paul had learned how to live with the visitor's paradox. The aliens, the messengers, had shown a mechanism that looked like a decision only because resonance meant experience would diverge. But the possibility of divergence did not nullify responsibility. If anything, it increased it. The knowledge that patterns accumulate demanded that people attend to the patterns they were cultivating. The last time Paul saw the visitor's light, it was less dramatic than the first. He stood on his backyard porch, hands in his pockets, winter clean around him. The air felt sharp and thin. He did not feel the awe he had at the beginning, so much as he felt a quiet, adult clarity. He asked no new questions. The presence, if it was the same one, transmitted a thought that was less about cosmic architecture and more about the ordinary heart. Stay with the work, the transmission said. Teach what you can. Be kind to those who do not yet know how to be kind. Paul's answer was a breath and a soft, simple assent. He thought of Linda and of the folded receipt in his pocket. He felt the weight of the years and the smallness of daily choices. He felt, too, the stubbornness of human life, our capacity to begin again and again. If you have followed this account and want a practical companion to the 7 practices the visitor described, concise steps that can be tried without ritual or drama, you can find a short guide linked in the pinned comment. It is meant to be a modest tool, a notebook template for gratitude, suggestions for grounding in nature, prompts for compassionate action, and simple ways to form a supportive circle. It is offered as support, not as a guarantee.
Use it to build habits that increase the probability that your life will resonate with the qualities you want to cultivate. What of the phrase that's the mechanism by which experiential paths diverge, and what if our repeated choices shape which path we are more likely to inhabit? The alien's role as he experienced it was a revealing rather than a final verdict. Understanding that difference changed both the tenor of his grief and the shape of his action. He still sanded wood at odd hours. He still found cardinals on cool mornings. He still missed Linda with a grief that had soft edges but did not dull into indifference. He still forgot mornings and wrote imperfect letters and failed to keep every promise he made to himself. He still, in the end, tried. There may be those who read this and feel unshakable certainty that nothing has changed. There may be those who are persuaded of the visitor's account and feel a new urgency. Either way, the practical kernel remains. Small, sustained actions, gratitude, focused work, time in nature, forgiveness, regular service, careful dialogues with grief, and chosen community tend to alter the habitual tone of life.
These are not miraculous guarantees. They are ways of living that make compassion a skill and prepare a person to meet ambiguity with steadiness. On a clear morning, years after the first blue-silver light, Paul walked to the little park his group had tended. Sarah ran ahead, her small figure a bright punctuation against the grass. Diane called from across the garden. Neighbors he had known for decades arrived with gloves and hot coffee. Some were skeptics, some had brought stories of their own phenomena, some came simply because they liked the company. The day was ordinary in the truest sense: work, laughter, a moment when someone helped another lift a stubborn root. Paul set his palm against a plank of wood he had brought to build a bench and felt, as he had felt so many times, the ring of years. He thought of the visitor's last words, "Stay with the work," of Linda's handwriting on a receipt folded into his pocket, of the small, ordinary practices that had shifted the cadence of his days. He thought of the title that had hooked strangers to his account, and of how he had learned to reframe the frightening image into a call to action that was humane rather than punitive. When the light slanted low and the cardinals sent their brittle notes into the trees, Paul sat on the newly built bench and watched Sarah draw 7 crooked suns in the dirt. He smiled the kind of smile that carries both sorrow and gratitude. He had not been given absolutes. He had been given an invitation to tune his life imperfectly and persistently toward compassion and presence. If the universe held other intelligences who map possibilities back to us, then perhaps their greatest gift was not intervention, but information, an account of how resonance shapes experience. If that is so, the moral test is not to ask who is judged, but to ask how we will live while judgment is reframed as choice. Paul decided, in the quiet of his pocket where Linda's receipt warmed the day, to keep tuning. He would continue to show up, to repair what needed repairing, to practice gratitude, to forgive, to serve, to listen for the small voices that needed a community to answer. And when strangers asked him, as they often did by email or in the doorway of Diane's circle, whether the visitor had decided who lives and who dies, he would close his eyes briefly, think of a tuning fork and a radio dial, and say the same thing he had said since the first blue-silver light. They described a mechanism we can learn from, and in learning from it, we make choices that matter. He would then hand them a cup of coffee, a folded guide in the pinned comment, and, if they wanted it, an invitation to sit with the group, to build a habit, imperfect and steady, that might change the music of a life.